Oh,
Okay, I'm doing my presentation on something like happiness, and the question, how is life different in post-communism? So, something like happiness, directed by how do you pronounce it? Bodan Slamov?
well, yes, okay.
Released in 2005, 16 years after the Velvet Revolution of 1989, is an intimate portrait of the lives of three young adults, Monica, Tonique, and Dasha, as they navigate post-communist life. This film is centered around economic instability, shifts in values, and emotional disorientation, but reveals glimmering moments of hope and resilience through small acts of community. So some brief historical context. Under communism, Czechoslovakia experienced one-party rule and the state's ultimate control over most aspects of life, such as production, housing, culture, and through guaranteed employment. The Velvet Revolution of 1989 saw the collapse of communist rule. In November of 1989, widespread public protests against the one-party communist government of Czechoslovakia occurred. Led by students and older dissidents, the pressure consequently led to the fall of the communist regime. One of the dissidents and leaders of these demonstrations was Václav Havel, a playwright and human rights activist who would become the first president of the country following the 41-year reign of communism. Havel promised to repluralize all aspects of domestic society and to reintegrate Czechoslovakia into the world. 3 years after the revolution, in around 1992 to early 1993, Czechoslovakia split due to growing political and cultural differences, separating into the two countries of Slovakia and the Czech Republic. Following the split, the Czech Republic was seen as the forerunner of economic transformation. In the post-socialist bloc, a transformation that was fundamental to the development of new Czech values. It was distinctive for its radical nature of transition, or shock therapy, an abrupt shift that meant that people had to adapt extremely quickly. So economic transformation following the 1989 revolution, to my understanding, is the backbone or overarching theme of many of the differences endured within society, and consequently portrayed in the film. Slammer uses setting and visuals of the film to embody what he perceives as post-communist reality. Following the 1989 revolution, bigger towns like Prague were subject to cosmetic changes due to their economic growth. The Czech Statistical Office's own quantitative maps, however, illustrate the economic divergence of the country. Prague and its immediate area are featured as bright red on the map due to it being the main recipient of foreign investment and tourism, whilst the smaller towns and more rural areas are shown as lighter shades of red and pink, signifying a lack of economic development. This is particularly relevant for the film as it's set in a small North Bohemian industrial town, left neglected and decaying. The grey and muted cinematography reflects the emotional climate of the time, early post-communism, left people uncertain and stuck within the new political system. And these dull visuals suggest that people's lives were stagnant, that despite the political and economic transformation, people were struggling to move forward and achieve economic prosperity. Further, the decaying panel-like housing where many of the film's characters reside is symbolic of the country's pre-transformation past. These housing blocks are remnants of the communist legacy, which once symbolized modernity and state-provided security. However, these same buildings are shown in the film as falling apart. The character of Tonic is shown in the film fixing a broken window in Das's flat during the height of winter with just paper. This slow collapse of the housing reflects the slow collapse of their once certain or ordered world as they struggle to build a future within the new system amidst the ruins of their past. there's no real improvement in the quality of their life. One of the strongest pieces of visual symbolism in Slama's film is the scene that depicts Monica and Tonique taking Dasha's 2 children out onto the lake. The scene suggests tranquility, yet is undermined by the view of the town's industrial skyline. This all emphasizes the sense that even in a moment of calm or a hope of escape from vulnerable reality, the characters still remain trapped by the visual of the factories used as a reminder of the collapsing position of the industry following 1989. So economic instability practically narrates the film. The shift from communist to capitalist society was felt heavily within the country's economy. Prior to the transition, the Czechoslovak economy was the most centralized of the communist economies, meaning that following communism, the country had to rebuild the market from scratch. A key feature of this rebuilding was the privatization of the economy. The Transformation Act of 1991 was directed towards large privatization, namely entities that were too large to be purchased by a single individual. This included heavy industry like the factories featured in the film. The government created a voucher system that allowed ordinary citizens to buy shares in companies relatively cheaply, making these state-run industries, moving these state-run industries into the public domain. However, this transformation was not free from corruption, with weak regulation and unclear ownership leaving many of these companies to fail. A factor of privatization relevant to the film was industrial restructuring. Under communism, heavy industry was prioritized, and much of Czechoslovakia's industrial plant predated communism. And so after 1989, once markets opened and industry was privatized, the outdated factories could not compete with modern or Western companies, resulting in an industrial collapse, with production falling by 33% between 1990 and 1992, and consequently a large loss of jobs in the country. This would have been extremely damaging for citizens who had once experienced life where unemployment was virtually non-existent. Once again, the setting of the film, the dilapidated industrial town, visually represents the economic decline after industry shut down, the abandoned factories, as a direct result of the transition to capitalism. The film shows the struggle of the generation of young adults who are stuck between the two systems, having grown up with socialist expectations of security and are now thrown into a competitive capitalist market with no guaranteed job prospects. Monica as a character embodies this economic instability. She works a low-paid job at the supermarket and lives with her parents, but longs for a stable and secure life with her boyfriend, who leaves for America at the beginning of the film. She believes that she can no longer achieve this stable life in Czech Republic. This dream of escaping to America mirrors regional westernization fantasies. The West, as Hyman states in her book, was believed almost as an article of faith to be rich, modern, and free. Monica, alongside many, believes that moving to America and joining her boyfriend will give her an escape from post-communist insecurity. The West was perceived as a symbol of opportunity and success, a fantasy that had been developed partly due to the sheltered life under communist control. Monica's mother further highlights this desire to flee from post-communist economic instability as we watch the excitement she shares with her daughter when Monica tells her of her plan to join her boyfriend and the job he has set up for her. However, this quote-unquote American dream does not last, as by the end of the film, we see Monica's return. In the final scene of the film, she is pictured looking out the window, smiling as she watches local young boys and dogs play, and she is reminded of the humanity that persists within ordinary Czech life, something that is not prevalent within the shackles of competitive capitalism, and she is moved by it. So Slama's film rejects the post-communist attitude of self-interest, a consequence of the new aggressive capitalist system. Dasha's married lover, Yara, embodies this business-orientated lifestyle, putting his bathroom sales career first before his humanity. And Dasha, whilst not necessarily career-driven, is still arguably symbolic of this capitalist self-interest. Her self-centered and obsessive psychological state leads to a breakdown, leaving her young sons traumatized and unsupported. She is eventually sent to a psychiatric hospital, and her children fall into the care of Monica and Tonique, not state institutions, somewhat mirroring the retreat of state welfare support and the underfunding of certain government sectors like the healthcare system, which hospital staff believed to be in such chronic decline that they mounted the Czech Republic's largest strike on the 1st of November in 1995. Upon her abrupt return from the psychiatric hospital, Dasha collects the children from Monica and Tonique's care, disrupting one of the fleeting moments of happiness within the film as they celebrate one of the young boys' birthdays. By coming in and abruptly disrupting the celebration, she destabilizes the order in which Monica had created in the boy's life, not only symbolizing the lack of efficiency of the underfunded healthcare system, because Dasha returns somewhat unhelped and is still rife with selfishness, but also the ongoing instability and uncertainty of change within post-communist life. Finally, Slama uses the character of Tonique as a personification of his critique of new capitalist society. Post-communist capitalism celebrated consumers' aspiration and competition, and Tonique rejects this, refusing to work in the local factory. Instead, Tonique spends the duration of the film continuously attempting to renovate the family-owned farmhouse, rejecting the ongoing interest of the nearby factory that wants to buy the land. The ongoing challenge is essentially a futile project. He has no money or support, embodying the struggle of many post-communist Czech citizens who find themselves trying to fix their lives with inadequate tools and limited opportunities. But due to refusal to fit himself into the new egotistical society, the end of the film sees him disappearing completely from the new normal Czech society, which he no longer belongs to. And as a result, the destruction of the farmhouse to be used as land for the factory goes ahead, highlighting how the new capitalist system persists and shows no morality. Slama exposes how post-communist capitalism produces new kinds of exclusions and fails to reward those who contribute most to community, like Tonique. His decency and loyalty to his community symbolizes the human Czech values that remain in few people, those that do not have any economic value but do have human worth, and show that small acts of care can create moments of happiness. So, by using the film Something Like Happiness to assess the difference in life after communism, it is clear that the film captures a transitional moment in Czech history. The economic and social instability the characters faced and characterized the earlier post-communist years were part of a broader and unfinished shift towards a new way of life. The characters' struggles show how the new capitalist economy created insecurity and unequal opportunities, a stark contrast with the guarantees of the communist system despite its limiting nature. Yet it is important to note that the film also shows the Czech identity and human resilience persists beyond overarching economic or political structures or systems. Moments of fleeting happiness, like the children on the boat at the birthday party, and the fragile sense of community highlight a continuity of human spirit that surrounds the struggles faced, that survives the struggles faced. So whilst post-communist life in this film is predominantly shaped by economic instability, it can be equally defined by the enduring search for meaning and happiness. This balance is key in understanding the difference between life before and after communism. Material conditions did change, but deeper human values remained.
Brilliant, thank you very much. Do you have any questions? You happy? as usual, a very good presentation, very thoughtful. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Please, this applies to both of you. Please put those PowerPoints on Moodle later,
Okay.
so that I can
How
put
do
the mark against it. What?
How do you do that?
There is a
Okay.
kind of, if you go onto Moodle for this course,
Yeah.
it says where you are supposed to submit your essays, and also there's a place submit your presentations.
Oh, okay.
So put it there because that's where I put the marks.
Right.
Okay.
Thank
You
so
very much. Your name will be there. Right. I just wanted to say before we get to the final one with David. Obviously, this course has devoted quite a lot of time. I'm repeating what I'm saying at 1 o'clock, but quite a lot of films criticizing various aspects of communism which were sort of made in the 60s. And finally, we've got these 3 post-communist films, and they have a look at 3 aspects of post-communism. So Bohdan Slama, yes, I know, 2005, it's again already 20 years old, this film, ridiculously. Those 2 boys, incidentally, in the film are Slama's children. And now time has flown. I have a filmmaker colleague in Prague who's using one of those boys as an editor these days. So obviously, if he was 5 there, he would be 25 now, he would be your age now, right? But you would have been these children's ages when this film was made. But anyway, he was the first one. This is his second film which dealt with kind of basically destitution, and actually ventured out of Prague, which filmmakers don't like because they of course enjoy it in Prague. And I want to say that of course Czech Republic is now much more wealthy than it was when communism was falling. Those early sort of problems of restructuring, which you said that, well, 33% of the economy collapsed in the first 2 years after the fall of communism, that has all been kind of removed. But although it is a very affluent country, it is mostly in cities. And of course, Prague is, as I keep saying, one of the most affluent cities in the European Union, and of course also like here, apartments are incredibly expensive now. They have become particularly expensive, and also like here, as a result of that, very few children are being born because young people can't afford their flats, amongst other things. So yes, it is now much richer, but the problems, the divisions between rich people and poor people remain. It's quite oligarchical, the Czech Republic, and there are maybe 20-30% of the population who are not that particularly rich, and the rural areas are neglected. The previous government didn't have any strategy for developing modern technology there. That's why they lost their election in October. So this is one thing. He started 20 years ago looking at these social problems and also emphasizing what the real humanity is, to be commended. So that was one aspect of it. Social problems arising from or continuing after the, or rising after the fall of communism. The other film that we had were Those Owners, which was basically about today, and that was a film which basically again continued in showing the selfishness and sort of idiotic consumerist self-obsession and arrogance and bigotry and absolute lack of community spirit, which is basically what destroys societies, and that's not only a Czech problem. And the final one is actually the contemporary look at historical events, and that will be David.
Hi, I'm doing my presentation on Volney.
Uh-huh.
I'm not sure how you pronounce that.
That's exactly how we pronounce it. Okay.
By Yuri Madel, which was released in 2024, and it looks at the events leading up to and including the Prague Spring, and specifically through the perspective.
I'm just wondering what will happen if I turn on the light, but it may be flickering, but we'll see. You'll probably survive it. Flickering on the. recording. Okay, go on.
Looking through the Czechoslovakian radio operators who were sort of sharing radio. The question is, where goes the line in this film between fact and fiction, and is the film lying? When I watched it, first, I didn't know anything about the Prague Spring, and I thought it was a really entertaining film, but however, I've enjoyed kind of looking and learning about that, and looking back, you can see the film actually paints quite an inaccurate picture of what's going on, which I will explore later on in the presentation. So first of all, just to give some of the background information that the film gives. So it follows the fictional characters of Thomas and Pavel, who are brothers in the film. So Thomas, he works as a mechanic before moving on to work for radio, and it follows the story of him and his brother Pavel as they sort of like struggle through living through the communist regime. At the very start of the film, it kind of gives the film gives these figures. So it says that the Soviet Union controls Eastern European countries, and their government is subservient to Moscow. And then it gives the figures that there were 1.3 million political prisoners, 5,800 executions, and millions of ruined lives. However, Blade has pointed out that actually these figures are just wrong. First of all, the film doesn't actually say exactly what these are referencing, so it's not clear if these are referencing kind of like the whole of if it's the whole of kind of like the Warsaw Pact, or just the Eastern countries that were under Soviet occupation, or Czechoslovakia itself. But in either case, whichever way you look at it, these figures are just wrong. So if you look at it and say if it's just having a look at Czechoslovakia, well, these figures are much too big. But if you have a look at it as say the sort of like Soviet Union and the kind of Eastern countries as a whole, well, then they're not big enough. So it creates a very misleading picture. I think the film is probably so it's not really clear what that's suggesting, and I think that's not great to have it for the start of the film to have such like a just misleading figures, and it really shows right off the gate that the film is not accurate and is really trying to portray sort of like an anti-communist agenda.
Yes, can I just say something? This is quite interesting. It's part of this thing that basically people in Eastern Europe, certainly in the Czech Republic, kind of have this thing that communism was the worst evil ever that afflicted the humanity. And actually, Muriel Blake somewhere else is actually saying that is actually insulting for the victims of the German Nazism, because actually German Nazis killed those 6 million Jews, and that basically this total emphasis. I am not excusing the crimes of communism, but one should be reasonable. I mean, and stick to facts. I want to mention here very briefly this David Olusoga, the historian who still is on the BBC. They still haven't censored him, running a brilliant series these days called Empire, which is really about the British Empire and its history. And he is just talking about providing evidence that actually the British Empire killed in India by artificial deliberate famine millions of people. So, I mean, communism wasn't the only horror that has actually afflicted the humankind through its history. It is, unfortunately, this is what that Olusoga says, whoever gets into power and the power is unchecked, it really produces incredible mass crimes. But anyway, go on, David.
So first of all, the film starts by showing a student protest. So there were sort of power outages, and in response, a lot of the students, they sort of march down and they're holding up candles and they're saying that we want light. And in response to this, in the film, it's shown that the communists police are just sent out, and they're sent to just brutally beat up all the protesters. But this actually creates a very misleading picture of what was going on at this event, because in reality, so first of all, actually, the communists misinterpreted what they were saying. So they interpreted sort of like the lights, as the students calling for light, as them calling for like enlightenment, or kind of like calling for kind of like a revolution. And also coincidentally, unknown to the students, they were actually heading towards where the communist leadership were meeting that night. So not that it justifies what the response was from the communists, but I think it's maybe understandable why they felt threatened in that time, and why they kind of like sent the police out, because they felt that the students were, you know, not just kind of protesting for light, but were actually, but were like really trying to like threaten the government. And also, it's important to note that I think in the film it really portrays the communist government as being just completely heartless, but in reality, many in the Communist Party Central Committee, they were horrified by this event. There were many that were really disgusted by actually what happened, and they continued to debate on this issue for months after it happened, which is not what's shown in the film at all, where it shows, again, like I said.
Yes, the film shows a united hardline of the communist leadership, but that's not true, because by the autumn of '67, the Communist Party was absolutely split, and maybe so 80–90% of the communists were reformists, and then there was about 10% of the hardline people. There was an ongoing struggle amongst them. So this is absolutely ignored by the film. Yes.
Yeah. So again, I think the film is really trying to show that the communists, it's just showing them as being totally evil, when in reality, actually, again, if you look at this event, you can see there's actually a little more nuance about what was going on. Yes, it was a terrible event, but it's not necessarily, it was more of like a very tragic misunderstanding, which again, it's just that kind of nuance is just not shown in the film at all, and it creates a very misleading picture of what communism is like. So we have a look at the communist government, which in the film is really presented as, again, as a brutal, repressive regime, without really showing any positivity. But really, you've got to question this picture, and I think when it actually comes down to scrutiny, it's just not right. So first of all, Jan Sulik argues that in his perspective, that actually under Novotny, the regime was rather passive. And even
well, again, if I may say, it's true that when Stalin died and his sort of slave, whatever, Gottwald, the communist, the Czech communist leader, in March '53, I think, Novotny took over, and he was obviously also a Stalinist. And as I keep saying in these classes, he couldn't properly condemn Stalinism and its crimes because he was implicated in it. But at the same time, while he was the top person, there were all these reformists, like, I don't know, Milan Kundera or various other filmmakers and writers, and then sort of this bloke Zdeněk Mlynář, who was a lawyer, and basically he was the author of the Prague Spring, and they were basically horrified, having been totally swayed by that utopian notion of communism when they were in their 20s. Suddenly they discovered that really it wasn't so wonderful, and then the crimes were committed, and they were trying to undo it throughout the certainly late 50s and yes, the 60s. And it's quite interesting, this thing. You saw that film Coach to Vienna, and the other one, The Ear, which was made by Karel Kachyňa with the writer Procházka, who wrote it. And Procházka, a total reformist, was actually a protege of that Novotny. And this is really interesting because, okay, so Novotny, say in the mid-60s, he was still a kind of, I would say, passive Stalinist. But why would he allow the making of these totally anti-communist films? Only out of friendship? Slight mystery. So I would say that notion that I'm saying that he was quite passive towards the second part of his tenure is probably right. It is true, however, that in April '68 they deposed him as a representative of the old regime.
Yeah. So so sort of to kind of continue on. So Novotny, he was certainly, not to say he was like a reformer, he was certainly, quite hardline and more authoritarian, but nonetheless, kind of like Jan mentioned, the party did have both anti and pro-reformers. So, but the film just doesn't show this. It shows them as kind of like, as all the people at the top being, hardline and incredibly authoritarian, which even in the leadership as well, many of the leaders were pro-reform as well. And even in the film, it actually hints a little bit to this as well, although you're still, when watching it, you're definitely supposed to feel that the communists kind of like are all evil. But Dubček, he was elected as first secretary of the Communist Party, but if everyone in the Communist Party had been sort of like really oppressive and didn't want any reform like shown in the film, well then clearly Dubček would never have been allowed to come to power, especially as it's noted that that the communists sort of like meddled in elections as well. So if everyone had been hardline at the top, then they just simply wouldn't have allowed it. However, the film also really, I think, overplays the importance of the social aspects as like the driving forces of change and ignores some of the other aspects which led to change as well. So, for example, in the film, when Novotny is deposed and is replaced by Dubček, this is presented as kind of being caused by it coming to light that that Novotny had sort of like engaged in corruption, but actually there were other factors at play which led to his downfall. So, for example, Sture has argued that it was the poor leadership of Novotny who failed to address the economic issues that were existing in Czechoslovakia, and actually he'd fallen out of favour with Moscow, and that this was really important in enabling Dubček to rise to power. But this fact is just completely overlooked in film, and in effect is just is shown as like 100% of kind of like the work of like the Czechoslovak radio team, sort of being able to share the information of the corruption, which no doubt did play a role, but had Novotny still had the backing of Moscow, maybe they wouldn't have allowed him to fall out of power. Mm-hmm. But again, that's really overlooked in the film. Now we'll have a look at sort of the role of secret police and having a look at Czech society at the time as well. So if we're having a look at Czech society, so again in the film, it's really shown as all freedoms are being repressed, people are living in fear of the secret police, when I think in reality, it's been argued that actually this wasn't the case. Blake has argued that the 1960s were a period of freedom and enthusiasm, and again you can see this by like the kind of like films and things that were being released. Even in the film, you see it, to an extent. Like there's a few scenes where you can hear the radio team listening to like Western music and things, but I mean nonetheless, you're still definitely given the sensation that it's a very authoritarian society. However, there's some that disagree with this. Eugenie argues that the time was maybe not as positive as some historians have made it out, but nonetheless, there was still liberalization. In any case, to what the actual reality of it is, sort of doesn't, strictly speaking, matter too much for this question, because it's either of these cases, it's just not what's seen in the film. It's shown as being entirely repressive and authoritarian, when in reality there was some degrees of liberalization.
There was in the 60s also some kind of aspects which I must have shaken the secret police. Novotny had the Home Secretary arrested, who was totally responsible for the secret police for alleged corruption, and replaced by somebody else. And then of course it's 68, but of course I'm not disputing the way this film depicts 68. The new communist leadership appointed somebody called Josef Pavel as Home Secretary, who actually was imprisoned by the communists. So they actually appointed a victim of communism to run the secret police, right? So certainly in 68, probably the secret police was totally kind of emasculated. I don't know, well, my personal memories are very kind of limited because I was a child, but before 68, but I don't think there was that kind of fear that the film shows, and that the secret police was so strong. Having said that, when looking at this, in June 1967, there was a Congress of Czechoslovak writers, and Milan Kundera and another writer, Ludvík Vaculík, made incredibly kind of anti-communist speeches calling on the public basically to rebel. And basically what Vaculík was said, you see, you have to form little local committees, and when there's a problem, basically define it, go to the authorities, demand solutions, and basically he wanted public initiative up and down the country. After this Congress, the secret police called them for an interview, questioned them, both Kundera and Vaculík. So I suppose it still existed, but nothing happened to them. It was just some kind of formal interview and they just let them go again. But nevertheless, it still existed. That was June 67. So that's what I'm saying, okay? Anyway, go on.
So if we're having a look at kind of the secret police, so actually the secret, like the role that the secret police were playing in society was decreasing in the 60s and was like much less than it had been under the Stalinist regime. I think in general, so the secret police were given less freedom to kind of like operate how they wanted. They were expected to be more directly controlled by the party, and in general, there was less sort of throughout the 60s, the amount of prosecutions for crimes against the state had also decreased as well, which is sort of again emphasizing that it wasn't quite as authoritarian as is presented in the film. Not that there wasn't any authoritarianism aspects to the government during the time, but certainly that it had decreased, and is not to the extent which is seen in the film, which is much more reminiscent of the Stalinist regime. And this is just not the reality of what was happening at this time. So having a look at the actual events of the Prague Spring, I spent a little bit of time sort of saying how the film isn't accurate, but actually I would say that, in my opinion, I think it kind of shows the Prague Spring pretty accurately and kind of what happened. The actions of kind of the Czech radio operators is very true. It is showing how how they were like continuing to broadcast during the Soviet occupation, and their heroism and importance in relaying information to the public was really important.
I also want to make one other comment here about 68. In 68, as a 15-year-old, I noticed that they had this program on Tuesdays and Thursdays on the radio between 8 o'clock and 11 o'clock at night. And basically they called it Songs and the Telephone. And basically this was on a station like Radio 2 here. They just played your rock music, and after every song, they would phone politicians home and interview them on the phone live. And this was incredibly hard hitting, right? And they did it through the whole Prague Spring. One of these people, these famous journalists, his name was Jiří Dinspír, I think it is in the film, played by somebody. And later on, much later on, he's now dead obviously, but way back, I don't know, in the 90s or early 2000s, there was some kind of conference, and he was there, and I talked to him, and I said, Mr. Dinspír, as a teenager, you had this program, Songs and the Telephone, and absolutely it was hard hitting, it was brilliant, I remember it during the Prague Spring. And do you know what he told me? But we didn't only broadcast it in the Prague Spring, we broadcast it for 5 years before then. It had existed from about 64, so I didn't know that. So they kind of sort of the grilled politicians live on the radio for 5 years before the Prague Spring. This is yet another argument against how it wasn't that it wasn't kind of oppressive in the 60s. Anyway, go on.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. Actually, I think I also forgot to say, but like also in the film as well, again, it's hinted at kind of the government being slightly less repressive, considering that Milan Weiner, you can see him being sort of portraying it's like a very kind of provocative radio show, and he's got in trouble a lot from kind of the higher ups, but nonetheless he's still not fired. So you would think in like a really repressive regime, when you're really clamping down on information, that you can just get rid of them, but they don't. But again, so you're still meant to feel that it is very repressive. So going back to the Prague Spring, so we're saying that the Czech radio operators, that's all shown very accurately. It's kind of been suggested that, once again, kind of like the role of sort of like social aspects have been maybe like overplayed a little bit, and that actually it's kind of like the declining economy that was a really important decision that led to the Soviets invading Czechoslovakia. Actually, I'd probably argue that that's not the case, because it was under like Novotony's regime that that there was a lot of like social issues, and Dubček only recently come to power, and he believed that that if like the economic growth kind of like was good, then this would kind of like appease Moscow, because he believed that sort of like economic growth would be very beneficial to kind of communism as a whole. And it seems unlikely that that Moscow would have sort of like allowed Dubček to come to power and to kind of like help improve the economy, which was quite an important aspect of that, and then proceed to get rid of him immediately because the economy wasn't great, which wasn't the fault of Dubček. I think the reality was the communists felt threatened by the liberalization of Dubček. And also in the film, it does show the economic issues that were existing as well. You can see Pavel and Thomas's home is not really in a great state. You can see they don't have lots of food and are very poor. So while it doesn't like directly talk about the economic issues that existed, it does show them, I think, well enough. Also, there is in the film, it's shown as there's a scene showing the Soviet propaganda, and it's portraying the people involved, kind of like the Czechs and the people looking to push these reforms as being fascists, when in actuality, Kremlin propaganda was kind of pushing it as a Jewish-led affair, which is kind of the exact opposite of what's shown in the film. And Blave suggested that the film is kind of like changing this is to link the Soviet and modern Russian regimes, because to kind of like justify Putin's invasion of Ukraine, they kind of like labeled a lot of the labeled kind of like the Ukrainians as fascists, and as kind of like a so that the Russian army can go and kind of like liberate Ukraine, which is obviously not the case, but it's really linking those regimes, and but as you see in the film here, you're deliberately changing the facts of history in order to suit a modern political agenda and to try and make it relevant, and which I think is not great and really doesn't make the film look great. Also, I think you can see during the film, I think it portrays the Prague Spring and sort of like the chaos surrounding it pretty accurately. So Kramer has noted how Soviet soldiers were under strict orders not to target civilians. You can see that there's one scene when there's like a car sort of distributing leaflets that's shot at by Soviet
I
soldiers.
find it very also never heard of anything like that, but maybe it happened. If it would have happened, that there were some people shot when you had these soldiers sitting, young soldiers, Russian soldiers sitting on their tanks. There was a woman near the Prague Arts Faculty who was running for a tram. She just graduated, and there was a stupid soldier sitting on a tank, and he shot her from a machine gun as she was running for the train. For the tram. He probably was afraid that she was running and was going to do something. So she's got a little monument there at that place. So these things, probably about 200 people were killed up and down the country during this invasion. But it is true, as you're rightly saying, the Soviet embassy was afraid to tell Moscow that actually this was a nationwide movement, and basically it said that it was just a conspiracy of some intellectuals. So basically when the Soviet troops came, they had these orders to actually behave, not to shoot the local population, unlike in Hungary in '56, which was an absolute bloodbath. They just basically, the Russians killed everybody, not in '68 in Czechoslovakia, okay?
Yes, so that is a good point. So again, I've not been able to find anything to say whether or not that kind of specific event happened, but nonetheless, you can see from this image of the Prague Spring, it was kind of pretty chaotic, and you can see in the film there's a lot of protests of.
These pictures are mostly from the street in front of Prague Radio.
Yeah,
and there were actually demonstrations, and there were these tanks, and the tanks shot randomly. And they actually shot into a tenement there, and that one tenement totally burned down, right?
Yeah.
So they are very dramatic pictures, but this was not replicated. This was not replicated throughout the whole city or whatever, right?
Yeah, no,
okay.
That is true.
Mm-hmm.
But I would say, nonetheless, I think if you kind of had a look at the demonstrations, and obviously you've kind of said how there were instances of some people getting shot. That I don't think an event kind of like the shooting at the car is necessarily outrageous or misleading, even if that event itself didn't happen. But nonetheless, I don't think the film actually presents the Prague Spring as a total massacre. You can see crowds of people, flying Czech flags and being fairly hostile to the Soviet troops without being.
Yes.
This
is the point, that they were caught on the hop by the fact that the general public was hostile to them. They thought that they were going to be welcoming them.
Yes, exactly. So I'd say it kind of creates a fairly accurate picture of what was going on. So I think it does a pretty good job at that. I would say though, in the aftermath, it's going to be a little misleading because it ends just after the Prague Spring and and Dubček is returned to power and the reforms are passed. But actually, a few months later, Dubček was removed from power, which is kind of totally, which is not mentioned by the film. So you can't say that it's inaccurate because where it stops at the end of the Prague Spring, that did happen. But at the same time, it kind of suggests that these were really important reforms, but in reality, Dubček was removed pretty shortly afterwards. So it creates a slightly maybe misleading picture of what was happening. And in conclusion, so I would say that the film is accurate in some regards, I'd say all the timeline of events is pretty correct, and I would say that the portrayal of the Prague Spring is accurate, especially having a look at the radio crews as well and their heroism during that day. However, I think the film lacks a lot of the nuance that existed in the Communist Party, and it portrays it as very black and white. Communist leadership are all bad, and the the reformers are all good, when in reality there's actually a lot of nuance in what's going on. I think it also overplays the importance of social aspects and ignores the importance of some of the political elements and to an extent some of the economic elements which were also important in leading reform.
Thank you very much. You've studied very well. You did quite a lot of work. I appreciate it. Questions? Well, okay, thank you very much. Well, look at the bibliography, of course. Brilliant. Thank you. Well, that's it. As I was saying, at 1 o'clock, I'm marking your essays. You're supposed to have them back on Thursday, but I may not be able to make it by Thursday, but certainly by the end of the week you'll have it, so that you can prepare your second essays. And thank you for doing this course. Anyway, the film Waves will still be shown tomorrow. If anybody hasn't seen it, I do recommend it. It's an interesting exercise for historians. And thank you very much, David, and thank you everyone, and have a very happy Christmas. Okay?
Thank you.